The golden afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets of Los Angeles. Children's laughter echoed from distant backyards, while the scent of fresh-cut grass drifted through the warm air. It was the kind of peaceful Sunday that made families feel safe, secure in their little corner of the world. 10-year-old Emily Martinez walked slowly down Maple Street, clutching her sketchpad against her chest like a precious treasure. She had just finished her weekend art class at the community center, her mind still buzzing with excitement about the watercolor painting she had completed. Her small fingers traced the edges of the pad, protecting the drawings inside that meant everything to her creative young heart. Emily wasn't like other children her age. While her classmates ran around screaming and playing games, she preferred quiet observation. She noticed things others missed: the way shadows danced on sidewalks, how flowers turned their faces toward the sun, the peaceful rhythm of suburban life. Her uncle Jean-Claude always said she had an artist's soul, and today proved him right. The green apple in her free hand was her reward for finishing the class early. She had saved it for the walk home, planning to enjoy it while sitting in her favorite spot under the old oak tree in her front yard. Just 2 blocks away, her mother was probably preparing dinner, maybe even making her favorite chocolate chip cookies as a Sunday treat. But the peaceful afternoon was about to explode into a nightmare no child should ever experience. The low rumble of an engine broke through the suburban silence. Emily glanced over her shoulder to see a black and white police cruiser creeping along the street, matching her walking pace perfectly. The car's presence felt heavy, oppressive, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Officer Ray Dunning sat behind the wheel, his cold eyes scanning the neighborhood through dark sunglasses. At 38 years old, he had spent 12 years on the force, building a reputation that made even his fellow officers uncomfortable. Complaints had been filed against him before, reports of excessive force, inappropriate behavior, cruel treatment of citizens. But somehow, those complaints always disappeared into filing cabinets, buried under bureaucratic procedures and department politics. Today, something about the sight of a young girl walking alone triggered his worst instincts. Maybe it was the stress from his recent divorce, or the mounting pressure from internal affairs investigations he thought were safely hidden. Whatever the reason, Ray Dunning was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The police car's window rolled down with a mechanical hum. Emily stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had been taught to respect police officers, to see them as protectors and helpers. But something about this man's presence felt wrong, dangerous. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" His voice cut through the air like broken glass. There was no kindness in it, no genuine concern. Instead, Emily heard something that made her stomach twist with fear, suspicion, aggression, the tone of someone looking for trouble. Emily raised her small hand and pointed down the street toward her house. "My house is right there, sir. I'm just going home from art class." Her voice was barely above a whisper, polite and respectful, just as her mother and uncle had taught her. But politeness meant nothing to Ray Dunning. His expression hardened behind those dark glasses, his mouth twisting into a cruel line. "ID?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh bark that echoed off the empty houses. Emily blinked in confusion, her young mind struggling to understand what was happening. "I'm 10 years old, sir. I don't have any identification." The words came out small and frightened, but honest. She had no idea that her simple truthfulness was about to trigger a violent reaction. Ray muttered something under his breath, words too ugly for a child to hear. The car door slammed open with a sound like a gunshot, and his boots hit the pavement with heavy, threatening steps. His shadow fell across Emily's small frame as he approached, each footstep bringing her closer to a nightmare she would never forget. "Where are your parents?" he demanded, his voice rising with authority and barely contained rage. Emily clutched her sketchpad tighter, her knuckles white with fear. She took a small step backward, hoping the scary man would just return to his car and leave her alone. "They're at home, sir. I just finished my art class. Please, I didn't do anything wrong." Her voice trembled, but she tried to stay calm, remembering every lesson about respecting authority figures. That respectful response should have ended the confrontation. Instead, it seemed to enrage Officer Dunning even more. His hand shot out like a striking snake, grabbing Emily's thin wrist with brutal force. The sketch pad fell from her arms, hitting the concrete with a sound like breaking dreams. Her green apple rolled away, forgotten in the gutter. "Don't get smart with me," he snarled, pulling her closer. Emily gasped, panic flooding through her small body like ice water. This wasn't supposed to happen. Police officers were supposed to help children, not hurt them. But as Ray Dunning's grip tightened around her wrist, Emily realized that sometimes the people who were supposed to protect you could become your worst nightmare. The peaceful Sunday afternoon had just become the beginning of a story that would change everything. Emily tried to twist away from the officer's painful grip, but Ray Dunning only squeezed harder. Her thin wrist felt like it might snap under the pressure of his thick fingers. Tears began forming in her eyes as she looked around desperately for help, but the suburban street remained eerily empty. Everyone was inside their homes, safely unaware of the horror unfolding on their peaceful sidewalk. "Please, you're hurting me," Emily whispered, her voice breaking with fear and pain. She had never experienced anything like this before. In her 10 years of life, adults had been sources of comfort and protection. Her teachers were kind, her neighbors were friendly, and her family surrounded her with love. This brutal stranger, wearing a police uniform, shattered everything she thought she knew about the world. Ray Dunning's face twisted with rage at her plea. Something dark and cruel lived inside this man, something that fed on power and fear. He had been getting away with increasingly violent behavior for years, protected by a system that valued silence over justice. Today, he felt completely untouchable. "You think you're special," he hissed, his grip tightening even more. "You think somebody's going to save you." Emily's mind raced through her terror, trying to remember everything her uncle Jean-Claude had taught her about staying safe. He had given her a phone for emergencies, showing her exactly which button to press if she ever needed help. "No matter what happens," he had said, "you call me immediately. Don't think, don't hesitate. Just press that button and I'll come running." At the time, Emily had thought it was just her uncle being overprotective. She never imagined she would actually need to use it. But now, with this dangerous man hurting her and getting angrier by the second, those lessons became her lifeline. Ray Dunning seemed to take pleasure in her fear. His eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction as he watched tears stream down her cheeks. This was what he lived for, the moment when someone realized they were completely powerless against his authority. He had done this before, to other children, other families. Each time, complaints had been filed and quickly buried. He felt invincible. "When I tell you to do something, you do it," he growled, his voice getting louder. "You don't ask questions. You don't make excuses. You show respect." But Emily had shown respect. She had been polite, honest, and cooperative. None of that mattered to Ray Dunning, because this was never really about respect or authority. This was about a broken man taking out his frustrations on someone too small to fight back. The pain in Emily's wrist was becoming unbearable. She could feel something grinding inside her arm, bones pressing against each other in ways that weren't natural. Ray Dunning seemed to enjoy watching her suffer, his grip becoming a torture device designed to break her spirit along with her body. That's when Emily made the decision that would change everything. With her free hand, she managed to pull out her phone. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely hold it, but she remembered her uncle's instructions perfectly. "Press and hold the emergency button, even if the screen is locked. Don't try to dial. Don't try to type. Just hold that button until you hear the connection." Ray Dunning noticed the phone, and his rage exploded into pure violence. "Put that away," he screamed, his voice echoing off the empty houses. But Emily had already pressed the button. Somewhere across the city, a phone was ringing in Jean-Claude Van Damme's house. The connection opened just as Ray Dunning made his most terrible mistake. Frustrated by Emily's defiance, enraged by her refusal to completely submit to his authority, he twisted her wrist with sudden, vicious force. The sound that followed would haunt everyone who heard it for the rest of their lives. Crack! The sharp, sickening sound of breaking bone cut through the afternoon air like a gunshot. Emily's scream tore from her throat, a sound of pure agony that no child should ever have to make. She collapsed onto the concrete sidewalk, her arm bent at an impossible angle, her world exploding into white-hot pain. Miles away, Jean-Claude Van Damme had just answered his phone, expecting to hear his niece's cheerful voice. Instead, he heard her screams. He heard a man's angry shouting, and he heard that unmistakable crack of breaking bone, transmitted with crystal clarity through the phone connection. For a moment that lasted forever, Jean-Claude's world stopped. His heart seemed to freeze in his chest as his mind processed what he was hearing. His beloved niece, the sweet little girl who brought him drawings and asked him to teach her martial arts moves, was being hurt. Someone was hurting her, and he could hear every second of it. Then adrenaline exploded through his body, like rocket fuel. The legendary action star who had performed countless fight scenes, who had trained his body and mind for decades of combat, felt a rage more pure and focused than anything he had ever experienced in movies or real life. He didn't speak into the phone. There was nothing to say. Emily was in danger, and he was going to reach her. Nothing else mattered. Jean-Claude grabbed his keys and sprinted to his car, the phone still connected in his hand. Every sob, every cry of pain, every cruel word from the officer poured directly into his ear as he started the engine and slammed his foot down on the accelerator. On the sidewalk, Emily lay crumpled and broken, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Ray Dunning stood over her, finally beginning to realize that maybe he had gone too far this time. But it was already too late. The call was connected, the damage was done, and somewhere in the distance, sirens were beginning to wail. The sound that changed everything had already been heard. Jean-Claude Van Damme's car tore through Los Angeles traffic like a guided missile. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel as he weaved between vehicles, ran red lights, and pushed his engine to its limits. Every second felt like an hour as Emily's cries continued to pour through the phone connection, each sob driving the knife of helplessness deeper into his heart. He had faced dangerous stunts, real fights, and life-threatening situations throughout his career, but nothing had ever felt like this. This wasn't about movie scenes or choreographed action sequences. This was about the most precious person in his world being hurt by someone who was supposed to protect her. Through the phone, he could hear new voices arriving at the scene. A woman's voice, probably a passerby, was shouting for someone to call an ambulance. A man was yelling at someone to back away from the child. But most clearly, he could still hear Emily's broken sobs and that monster's voice making excuses, trying to justify what he had done. She was resisting arrest. Ray Dunning was saying to someone, "I had to use appropriate force to subdue the suspect." Suspect. He had called Emily a suspect. A 10-year-old girl walking home from art class was, in this man's twisted mind, a criminal who deserved to have her arm broken. The rage building in Jean-Claude's chest was becoming something beyond anger, beyond fury. It was becoming a force of nature. Back on Maple Street, Emily lay on the sidewalk surrounded by concerned neighbors who had finally emerged from their houses. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was kneeling beside her, speaking in soothing tones while carefully avoiding her broken arm. Mr. Rodriguez had arrived with a clean towel to wipe her tears, and several other people were forming a protective circle around her. Ray Dunning found himself facing something he had never experienced before, witnesses who weren't afraid of his badge. These weren't isolated victims he could intimidate into silence. These were angry community members who had watched him assault a child, and they were not going to let him walk away. "I saw everything," Mrs. Patterson was telling someone on her phone, probably 911. "That officer attacked a little girl for no reason. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just walking home." "Get his badge number," Mr. Rodriguez called out. "Make sure you get his badge number and license plate." Ray Dunning realized his situation was spiraling out of control. In the distance, sirens were getting louder. Soon there would be ambulances, more police, supervisors, and investigations. His usual tactics of intimidation and cover-up weren't going to work this time. Not with this many witnesses, not with this much evidence. He looked down at Emily, still clutching her phone, still connected to someone who was hearing everything. For the first time in his career, Officer Ray Dunning felt the cold touch of real fear. Emily's voice, weak but determined, managed to whisper into her phone, "Uncle Jean-Claude, it hurts so much. He broke my arm. Please help me." Those words hit Jean-Claude like physical blows. His foot pressed down harder on the accelerator as he took a corner at dangerous speed, tires screaming against asphalt. He was still 15 minutes away. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours, while his knee suffered. "I'm coming, Emily," he said into the phone, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Stay strong for me." The ambulance arrived first, paramedics jumping out and rushing to Emily's side. They worked with professional efficiency, carefully examining her arm while speaking to her in calm, reassuring voices. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, noticed Emily still clutching her phone. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "My uncle," Emily whispered. "He's coming to get me." The paramedic took the phone for a moment. "Sir, this is paramedic Sarah Chen. We're taking care of your niece. She has a fractured arm, but she's stable. We're transporting her to General Hospital." Jean-Claude's voice came through clear and controlled. "Take care of her. I'll be there in 10 minutes. What the paramedic didn't know was that she had just spoken to one of the most famous action stars in the world. What Ray Dunning didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life by hurting the niece of a man who had spent decades learning how to fight, how to find people, and how to get justice. As the ambulance pulled away with Emily inside, Ray Dunning tried to leave the scene, but the gathered neighbors weren't about to let him escape. They had taken photos, recorded videos, and memorized every detail. When his supervisor arrived, there was already a mountain of evidence waiting. Detective Maria Santos had worked with Ray Dunning before and had always suspected he was trouble. Now, looking at the witness statements and hearing the recording that Mrs. Patterson had made on her phone, she knew this was the end of the road for him. "Officer Dunning," she said coldly, "you're suspended pending investigation. Turn in your weapon and badge." "That kid was resisting," Ray protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "I had to use force." "You broke the arm of a 10-year-old girl who was walking home from art class," Detective Santos replied. "There's no justification for what you did here today." Meanwhile, Jean-Claude finally arrived at the hospital, his heart pounding as he ran through the emergency room doors. The sight of his niece on a stretcher, her arm in a temporary cast, her face still streaked with tears, nearly brought him to his knees. "Uncle!" Emily's voice cracked with relief as she saw him. "You came." "I promised I would," he said softly, taking her uninjured hand in his. "I will always come when you need me." But as Jean-Claude sat beside Emily's hospital bed, listening to her describe what had happened, he knew this was far from over. The man who had hurt his niece was still out there, still wearing a badge, still capable of hurting other children. The system had protected him before, and it might try to protect him again. That was something Jean-Claude Van Damme was not going to allow. The hospital room felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos outside. Jean-Claude sat beside Emily's bed, watching doctors and nurses work to properly set her broken arm. Each professional who examined her reacted the same way: shock, disgust, and anger that someone had done this to a child. "The fracture is clean but severe," Dr. Peterson explained to Jean-Claude. "Someone used significant force to cause this kind of break. This wasn't an accident or the result of normal restraint procedures. This was deliberate." Emily drifted in and out of sleep, exhausted by pain and trauma. But even in her dreams, she kept the phone clutched in her good hand, as if maintaining that connection to her uncle was the only thing keeping her safe. Jean-Claude watched her small chest rise and fall, his heart breaking with each breath she took. While Emily rested, Jean-Claude began making calls, not to lawyers or publicists, but to people who could help him understand exactly what kind of man had hurt his niece. What he learned made his blood run cold. Ray Dunning had been the subject of 17 complaints over 12 years on the force. Parents had reported inappropriate behavior with their children. Teachers had filed concerns about his conduct during school visits. Fellow officers had quietly expressed discomfort with his methods. But somehow, every complaint had disappeared into bureaucratic procedures. Every investigation had been quietly closed. Every victim had been silenced. Emily was not Ray Dunning's first victim. She was just the first one with an uncle who could make the world listen. By evening, News of the incident was beginning to spread through social media. The recording from Emily's phone, combined with cell phone videos taken by neighbors, painted a clear picture of police brutality against a child. But Jean-Claude knew that social media outrage alone wasn't enough. He had seen too many stories disappear after a few days of trending hashtags. This required a different approach. That night, Jean-Claude made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to hide behind lawyers and public relations teams. He wasn't going to let the system handle this quietly. He was going to find Ray Dunning himself and look him in the eye. It didn't take long to locate him. Men like Ray Dunning were creatures of habit, and Jean-Claude had resources that most people didn't. A few phone calls to contacts in the industry, people who specialized in finding information, and he had everything he needed to know about Ray Dunning's routines. The Sunset Diner on Main Street was Ray's regular spot for late dinner. He went there every Tuesday and Friday, always sitting in the same booth, always ordering the same meal. Tonight was Tuesday, which meant Jean-Claude knew exactly where to find him. The diner was exactly what you'd expect from a place that stayed open all night. Worn vinyl booths, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired, and the smell of coffee that had been brewing too long. Ray Dunning sat in his usual booth, scrolling through his phone, probably reading the growing online coverage of what he had done. He didn't look worried. If anything, he looked annoyed, as if Emily's broken arm was an inconvenience to his evening routine. He snapped his fingers at the waitress for more coffee, treating her with the same casual disrespect he showed everyone he considered beneath him. Jean-Claude watched from across the street for several minutes, studying this man who had hurt his niece. Ray Dunning looked exactly like what he was, a bully who had been given a badge and the authority to terrorize people. But tonight, he was about to meet someone who couldn't be bullied. When Jean-Claude walked into the diner, conversation didn't just stop, it seemed to evaporate. Every head turned, every eye widened. The famous face was unmistakable, but more than that, his presence filled the room with an energy that made everyone suddenly alert. Ray Dunning looked up from his phone, irritation flashing in his eyes. He was ready to dismiss whoever was interrupting his meal, but when he saw who was approaching his booth, the color drained from his face like water from a broken glass. "Can I help you?" Ray managed to say, his voice steady, but his hands beginning to tremble slightly. Jean-Claude didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed his phone on the table and pressed play. The diner filled with sound, Emily's frightened voice, Ray's cruel demands, and then that horrible crack of breaking bone. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Conversations died completely. The only sounds in the entire restaurant were those coming from the phone. When the recording ended, the silence was deafening. "You know who that little girl is?" Jean-Claude's voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "She's my niece." Ray Dunning's face went from pale to gray. His hands were openly shaking now, and sweat had begun to form on his forehead. Around them, other diners were taking out their phones, recording this confrontation that they sensed was historic. "And I," Jean-Claude continued, his accent making each word distinct and memorable, "am Jean-Claude Van Damme." The gasps around the diner were audible. Phones lifted higher. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was a moment that would be shared around the world within hours. Ray tried to muster some of his old arrogance. "Are you threatening me?" Jean-Claude leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Ray's face. "If I were threatening you, you would already be on the floor. But I'm not here for violence. I'm here to make sure you understand something very important." He slid a folded napkin across the table. Written on it in precise handwriting were the words, "Room 12, General Hospital. 10 years old. Broken arm. 17 complaints. The world is watching." Ray stared at the napkin, his hands now visibly shaking. Around him, the restaurant buzzed with quiet outrage as people processed what they had just heard and seen. Phones captured his fear from every angle. Jean-Claude stood up, his final words clear enough for everyone to hear. "By the time the world is done with you, that badge you abuse will be worth less than that napkin." He turned and walked out, leaving Ray Dunning alone with a room full of witnesses and the growing realization that his 12 years of getting away with cruelty had just come to an end. Outside, protesters were already gathering. The video from the diner was spreading faster than wildfire, combined with the original recording from Emily's phone. By midnight, Ray Dunning's name was trending worldwide, and not in a good way. Justice had finally called his name. The video from the diner spread across the internet like lightning. Within 6 hours, #JusticeForEmily was trending worldwide. The confrontation between Jean-Claude Van Damme and Officer Ray Dunning had been captured from multiple angles, creating a complete record of the moment when a bully realized his protection was gone. But the real power wasn't in the celebrity confrontation. It was in the audio recording that preceded it. Emily's voice, frightened but brave, followed by that sickening crack of breaking bone, had awakened something in people across the globe. Parents held their children tighter. Communities demanded answers from their police departments. The story had become bigger than one incident, bigger than one family's pain. Ray Dunning woke up to find news vans parked outside his house. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers, and internal affairs investigators. The department that had protected him for 12 years was now scrambling to distance themselves from the growing scandal. By noon, Police Chief Williams called a press conference. Standing behind a podium covered with microphones, he looked uncomfortable as he announced that Officer Ray Dunning had been suspended pending a full investigation. The words sounded hollow, practiced, like something read from a legal script rather than spoken from genuine concern. But the public was no longer satisfied with standard bureaucratic responses. They had heard Emily's cries. They had seen Jean-Claude's controlled fury. They wanted more than suspension. They wanted justice. That afternoon, the inevitable happened. Ray Dunning was arrested at his home, handcuffed on his own front lawn while neighbors watched and cameras rolled. The man who had terrorized a 10-year-old girl now looked small and pathetic as he was loaded into the back of a police car, his head down in shame. Emily watched the footage from her hospital bed, her arm now properly cast and decorated with drawings from nurses and well-wishers. She turned to Jean-Claude with wide, serious eyes. "Is it over now?" she asked quietly. Jean-Claude took her small hand in his large one. "The first part is over. But this is bigger than just him now." He was right. The case had exposed a system that had failed not just Emily, but countless other victims whose complaints had been buried, whose voices had been silenced. Lawyers were coming forward with stories of police misconduct, cases they had been pressured to drop. Families were finding the courage to speak about incidents they had kept secret for years. The trial, when it finally began 3 months later, was unlike anything the legal system had seen. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters demanding justice. Inside, every seat was filled with people who had been touched by Emily's story, victims of police brutality, their families, community activists, and ordinary citizens who simply wanted to see right triumph over wrong. Emily testified with remarkable courage for a child so young. She spoke clearly about what had happened, never exaggerating, never seeking sympathy, just telling the truth about a man who had hurt her for no reason. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Jean-Claude's testimony was equally powerful. He described hearing his niece's pain through the phone, the helplessness of being miles away while she suffered, and his determination to ensure that no other child would experience what Emily had endured. The defense tried to paint Ray Dunning as a dedicated officer who had simply made an error in judgment. But 17 complaints, multiple witness testimonies, and that devastating audio recording made their case impossible to sustain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of assault, guilty of excessive force, guilty of child abuse. Ray Dunning was sentenced to 5 years in prison, his badge stripped away, his pension forfeited. But the story didn't end with Ray Dunning behind bars. It ended with something much more powerful: change. The SHIELD initiative, founded by Jean-Claude with Emily as its inspiration, became a national organization dedicated to protecting children and holding authority figures accountable. Emily's drawing, a little girl with a cast on her arm standing tall and strong, became their logo, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs, focusing on de-escalation and appropriate treatment of minors. The Emily Protocol became standard procedure, requiring immediate supervisor notification and independent investigation of any incident involving force against children. Most importantly, a system was created to ensure that complaints against officers could never again be buried in bureaucratic silence. Every report would be tracked, investigated, and made part of permanent records that followed officers throughout their careers. Emily healed, both physically and emotionally. Her arm regained full strength, and she returned to her art classes with renewed passion. She began speaking at schools and community events, sharing her story and encouraging other children to speak up when adults treated them wrongly. On the anniversary of that terrible Sunday afternoon, Emily and Jean-Claude visited the spot where it all happened. The sidewalk looked the same, but everything had changed. A small memorial garden had been planted by neighbors with a plaque reading, "In honor of Emily's courage and all children who find their voice." Emily placed a drawing at the base of the memorial, not of her broken arm or the officer who hurt her, but of children playing safely in the street while police officers watched protectively from nearby. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, were the words that had become her motto: "I'm stronger now, and so are we." Jean-Claude wrapped his arm around his niece's shoulders, proud beyond words of the young woman she was becoming. What had begun as a moment of horrible cruelty had transformed into a movement of hope, proving that sometimes the darkest moments can spark the brightest changes. The bad cop who had attacked the wrong child had indeed chosen his victim poorly, but more than that, he had awakened a sleeping giant of justice that would protect children long after his name was forgotten. Emily's voice, carried through a phone call on that quiet Sunday, had become a roar that echoed around the world, ensuring that no child would ever have to face such cruelty alone again.